Welcome to Pandemonium U. We're here to talk about your article in the Financial Times this week, cover story called France's MeToo Moment. You interestingly start out your article by talking about 1968 in France. Why is that critical to what's happening now? We know there was a big student revolution then, but why is it part of the MeToo movement?
Well, the student revolution really shapes French views on sexuality, which is the subject of this article, into the present day. Because in 1968, France is still a very pious, quite straight-laced Catholic nation. It's not this kind of stereotype of a sex-filled paradise that many foreigners have of France. It's very traditional. The president's wife, Yvonne de Gaulle, wife of Charles de Gaulle, tries to not let any divorcees or adulterers be appointed as ministers. She tries to influence her husband not to do that. Abortion is illegal. It's still very hard for women to procure the birth control pill. And at the universities, which are growing and growing very fast with all the baby boomers, the men's and women's dormitories are separate and they're not allowed to visit each other's dormitories at night. So it's a very kind of anti-sex society.
But then the revolution happens and all this kind of comes down.
Well, and the revolution of 68 is really prompted partly by sexual frustration. So it starts in January 68, the minister Missouf visits the campus at Nanterre, one of these new universities just outside Paris. And a student called Danny Cohn-Bendit, who will become the leader of the student revolution, comes up to him, catches a light, starts smoking and says to Missouf, you know, we're not allowed to visit the women's dormitories at night, it's a scandal. And Missouf said, well, we just built a swimming pool on campus. You should take a dive in there to cool yourself down.
Just go for a swim.
And Cohn-Bendit says that's a response worthy of the Hitler Youth. And so tensions rise and rise. And by May, you know, all Parisian universities are in revolt. And the center of it all becomes the left bank, the Rive Gauche, where a theater is occupied. And the students start to kind of dream of a new society. And you have slogans like underneath the paving stones, the beach, and it is forbidden to forbid becomes a very important slogan. The idea that everyone should be free and that the restraints of the society, this very Catholic society that they'd grown up in, should be thrown off.
Including all these sexual restraints.
Above all, the sexual restraints. That's really the most irritating thing. That's really the casus belli, I would say, of 68. More than
the what?
anything. The cause of the war of the 1968 revolution.
Oh, sorry. Was that Latin?
Yes.
Sorry.
The idea that France needs a sexual revolution.
Yes.
And another slogan is to enjoy without barriers, which is of course very sexually loaded. Yeah. So 68 introduces this generation onto the French stage, one of whose core beliefs is people should be able to express themselves sexually however they want. And there's also a feminist component to 68, which is less prominent. Women do not get that prominence in the media and do not get the attention. But part of that is also saying that women should be allowed to enjoy and express themselves sexually. And so this is all great. And it sort of becomes a model for how post-60s generations in France and elsewhere live. Of course, similar things are happening in other countries around the world. But then 68 takes a strange turn later on, which is...
Because those people, they're known as the 68ards, the generation of 68 in Paris, they go on to have children and occupy prominent positions in the French intelligentsia and the government, etc.
Yeah, so the generation born around 1950 at university in 68, come out, they have kids, and Danny Cohn-Bendit, the leader of the revolution, he actually sets up an anti-authoritarian kindergarten in Frankfurt, Germany, because Cohn-Bendit is a German Jew who has spent his life between France and Germany, is fluent in both languages. And in the mid-70s, he talks about how children have this magnificent sexuality and that children are always flirting with him, and it's very exciting. And so part of the 68 is that children also have the sexuality which they should enjoy, and that pedophilia is great because, you know, adults and children should have the right to have free sexual relationships with each other. And in 77, there's a petition signed by many French intellectuals, including Jean-Paul Sartre, Simone de Beauvoir, Roland Barthes, published in Le Monde and in Libération, saying that, you know, the pedophilia laws should go and that pedophilia should be legalized. So this too.
So basically the whole much of the French literary establishment signs petitions saying pedophilia should be okay in the 70s.
Yes, a lot of the cultural elite, and of course nobody more influential than Sartre and de Beauvoir, gets behind this petition, which turns out was written by Gabriel Matzneff, who is a pedophile writer. He writes these kind of pornographic pedophile journals and novels. And so you have various—
He's a prominent writer who's an openly practicing pedophile.
Well, and he also writes open pedophilia, and you have a number of writers writing pedophilia at the time. And it seemed that, you know, only the Catholic bourgeoisie, which is so prudish and restrictive, would ban such a wonderful thing. And so a large—
And the Americans would ban it. I mean, they're seen as the opposite of the sort of Puritan Americans.
Yeah.
So they see themselves that way.
A lot of French sexuality is defined in opposition to the Americans. So anything the Americans do in this view must be bad. And Americans are Puritan, Americans are anti-sex, and therefore any kind of sexual freedom is good. And, you know, to some degree they get confirmation in 1998 when you get the Lewinsky affair and America impeaches a president because of consensual adultery.
Right.
So
but,
that's kind of the opposite.
Yeah, so let's be really clear. Daniel Cohn-Bendit says he never practiced pedophilia, and there's no evidence that Sartre or de Beauvoir practiced pedophilia. In some ways, this was a sort of intellectual expression of freedom, but it doesn't mean they actually were pedophiles.
Yes, and when Cohn-Bendit's statements about pedophilia were revisited 25 years later in this century, he said, look, these were fictions. I was just trying to shock the bourgeoisie. I've never been a pedophile. And parents of kids at the kindergarten and the kids themselves, now adults, agreed. They said, look, he is not a pedophile. This is just an imagining. But it's significant he's not a pedophile, but it's significant he was writing this to shock the bourgeoisie, because shocking the bourgeoisie was a huge part of the impetus behind 68. And 68 for this generation remains their dominant intellectual influence. It's something they carry with them their whole life.
Yeah, but it turns out, and we're learning now, that pedophilia was happening because the people who were children then are now coming out with books about what happened to them. And that's what has transformed the French landscape, and that's what you write about in your piece.
Yeah, so children of the generation of 68 were raised in this culture of, you know, free love is good, children should have sex very early, and it's also fine if they have sex with adults. And so there have been two shocking memoirs which have really caused an enormous amount of attention in France. Really, books have had a huge impact. And one is by Vanessa Springora, who aged 14 had a relationship in the 1980s with the pedophile writer Matzneff, who wrote the pro-pedophilia petition.
Right.
Matzneff is now 86. And still around. And Springora's mother was a 68 who approved or allowed this relationship. And then
her mother's whole circle of friends knew this was going on.
Everyone knew that she was having a relationship with Matzneff. Everyone in the circle. And the police brigade of minors occasionally would visit Matzneff because he seems to have written anonymous letters denouncing his own relationship. And they were very gentle with him because he was a famous writer, and writers are very respected in France, of course. And just around the corner, this is all the Rive Gauche, the left bank, the kind of epicenter of 68. And just around the corner from Springora is the Kouchner family, where Camille Kouchner has just written a book saying that her brother was being raped by their stepfather, Olivier Duhamel.
We should say who the Kouchner family is, because her father is Bernard Kouchner, who's one of the co-founders of Doctors Without Borders. Her mother was, I think, is she a prominent artist?
The mother was Evelyne Pissier, who was a prominent law professor, who also, she and Bernard Kouchner met in Cuba on a kind of pro-Cuba visit in the 60s, where Pissier was selected by Fidel to have the honor of spending the night with him. And she and Fidel later had a relationship for a while. She and Bernard Kouchner, they meet during this trip to Cuba, they marry, they have these children, they later divorce. And Pissier takes up with Duhamel, Olivier Duhamel, who is also a law professor, and they raise their children, with all their peers, their 68 peers, friends, and they have these long summers in his summer house in the south of France. And in this circle, kind of free sexuality, it is forbidden to forbid, are kind of the mantras of this circle.
So the children are exposed to the values of the 68 Downs, the generation of 68, sort of in practice. So now we're getting to see it from the children's perspective, and it sounds terrifying.
It sounds terrifying. And Camille Kouchner writes in her book that when her brother tells her, age 14, he's her twin brother, that he has been raped repeatedly by the stepfather, neither of them is quite sure whether this is wrong. And the brother also feels, well, maybe I consented because I didn't try to stop him. And we now know, of course, it's very hard for children to not, to fight back against their parents, who are the people they trust most and who they're reliant on in every way. And so the children don't know what to do. And later they tell their mother years later, and she says, oh, you're just trying to steal my husband from me. And it's not really so bad. And so nobody takes this rape, this incest seriously.
Yeah, and Vanessa Springora has exactly the same problem. She thinks maybe this is okay. Maybe this is a legitimate relationship. She's kind of excited to have the attention of this powerful, older, respected writer.
Yeah, and Springora's book is called Consent in English, Consentement in French, which raises the question of, can a child really consent? Because, she has agreed to this relationship, but then she's only 14 and Matzneff at this point is 50. And so consent is really at the heart of what both these books are about, which is 68 is about free sex between consenting participants, but can the participants fully consent? And this is also part of, MeToo, when it hit America in 2017, it didn't initially land in France because older French women of the 68 generation, like Catherine Deneuve and Catherine Millet, who wrote this kind of Sexual Life of Caroline O book.
Catherine M, I think it was.
No, it's Caroline O. She doesn't use her own name. So Millet and when MeToo arrives, Millet and Deneuve are among 100 mostly older French women who sign a petition saying MeToo is ridiculous and the game of flirting between men and women shouldn't be stopped, and MeToo is just an American Puritanism gone mad. And so what we're seeing in France is this generational clash now arise between the children of the 68ers who say, look, consent is not as easy and clear as you think it is. Yeah. And certainly children cannot consent. And so what we're seeing now is a kind of sexual revolution in France that strikes back at the previous one, at the sexual revolution of 68.
So these books, and we should point out that Gabriel Matzneff, the pedophile writer, was extremely prominent in France. I mean, he's still winning literary awards into the 2000s. He
won the Prix Renaudot in 2013, partly because French literary prizes are often given to friends by other old friends. So if you've been in the milieu for many decades, you have friends who give you literary prizes. He won,
and he had some kind of stipend from the state. He was sort of living off the state.
A lot of writers get stipends from the state to help them get by so they can keep producing books. I mean, there's also Frédéric Mitterrand, the nephew of François Mitterrand. Frédéric Mitterrand wrote kind of pedophile literature. He says he himself has never been a pedophile, but he writes this literature about a man going to Southeast Asia and having sex with boys. He became culture minister after writing those books. So from 2009, I think, to 2012, he was culture minister. There was a bit of a fuss, he'd written pedophile literature, but it didn't stop him in the end.
So these books, these two books, the Kouchner book and the Vanessa Springora book, the Me Too had kind of sizzled and there hadn't been many prominent cases, and suddenly these two books land, and they have an enormous impact. Why do you think that they had that impact?
Well, they have an enormous impact, partly because they free the conversation about incest and pedophilia. So in France, there's now a hashtag called MeToo Incest, where people use that hashtag to come out on social media about their experiences of incest. And so they talk about having been, how would you put it, sexually abused, age 5, age 13, whatever it is, by a brother, an uncle, a cousin, a father. And so terrible stories. And there was one survey in November where 1 in 10 French people said they had been a victim of incest. So it seems, I mean, of course, these figures are very hard to know and to judge, but given that admitting to having experienced incest is still an enormous taboo, if 1 in 10 people in a poll will admit to that, it clearly is quite a widespread problem. Now, incest and pedophilia happen in all countries, but in France, more than I think elsewhere, they had the endorsement of a lot of the cultural elite and the political elite, which in France are overlapping groups. And so that makes it also harder to have strong laws against incest and pedophilia. The French law on those things was tightened in March because it wasn't very tight before, and it allowed for this idea, some idea of consent by a child. Right. So it seems to, it unleashed a debate, to answer your question, because it seems that a very large number of people have experienced this.
Yeah. You interviewed Leila Slimani, the French Moroccan writer, for this article. What's her view on how things are changing now?
Well, Slimani is very well known for her book called Lullaby in Britain. I think it might be called The Nanny in the US. And she believes that the idea of France as a country of, you know, Latin lovers and the land of romance is irritating, boring, cliched, and untrue. And that what's happening now is women, she said, are tired of being the gender of fear, which is a phrase from the French feminist writer Virginie Despentes. And so it's time, now is the time for women to hit back against the kind of what French people have often called galanterie française, the kind of French gallantry, the idea that a man murdering his female partner was a crime of passion, which is a French media euphemism. This all needs to go, she says. And she's also engaged with a sexual revolution in North Africa, because of course, a lot of North Africa is French speaking in part. She grew up in Morocco, and she has written a book called Sex and Lies in English about North African hypocrisy around sex. So homosexuality is officially taboo. Women as bodies are controlled by their partners. There is a huge amount of sex, but it's all taboo and under the table. And so she's written against that, against the control of women's bodies in North Africa by men, but using again the French language, the power of French writers, which as the Springora and Kouchner books have shown, is still very large.
Yeah, and you are seeing an amazing legal crackdown on some of these people men who've been accused. A series of very prominent men, including Matt Sneff, but by no means limited to him, have now been accused of many decades of sexual abuse. And you have Gerard Depardieu, who's been accused of rape. Is that right?
Yeah, Depardieu has been charged with rape. A very prominent former French newsreader, Patrick Poivre d'Arvor, has also been accused of various sexual crimes. And a former head of a model agency, Brunel, who was an associate of Jeffrey Epstein, has also been accused. And, you know, the two cases that the books are about, unfortunately, the crimes happened too long ago to be prosecuted, almost certainly. So Olivier Duhamel and Gabriel Metznev will probably never stand trial.
But Duhamel his reputation has certainly been battered, and he's had to resign from a few posts.
Yeah, I mean, bizarrely, he was secretary of the most elite dining club in France called Le Siècle, where, you know, the most powerful people, largely men in Paris, gather every month. It's an amazingly powerful elite network. And he was the secretary. He seems to have been proposed as secretary even after some people knew that he had been accused of incest. And now he has gone from there. So there is a cleaning up that's happened. Various people in prominent posts have resigned because they knew about all this. But it seems that the 68 generation, which has held power over so much of France for the last 50 years, is coming to its end.
Yeah, I mean, you sometimes hear that you don't change people's minds, you just wait for the next generation to come up with new ideas. Is that sort of what's happening here?
Yeah, and the phrase in science that scientific revolutions happen one funeral at a time. Here, France isn't really waiting for the funerals. It's defenestrating, dislodging people in power before the funeral. So it's not really just a question of this generation aging out. It's that their children have grown old enough to accuse in many cases. And the influence of the US through MeToo, I think, is very significant.
Yeah, and there's a whole generation of young French feminists who say they want seduction, they want romance, they want eroticism, but they want it on equal terms. And this whole, history of, like, as you say, what we call gallantry and seduction was unequal, and it should now be made illegal. I mean, that's their view.
I mean, look, when we talk about France, we always have to remember that France is not a unique country. France is part of the Western world. And what we've seen in the Western world the last decade is a kind of revolution of sexual equality. So the new ideal that's been imposed in the Western world, very largely agreed on, is that the ideal relationship is the equal relationship. You have two equal people consenting to it. And that's why gay marriage has been legalized everywhere, because gay marriage is kind of the ultimate equal relationship. There isn't even a gender imbalance where the man has power over the woman. And so gay marriage has been approved, and meanwhile pedophilia has been given immense disapproval because it's the most unequal relationship. So the criteria by which we judge now is a relationship equal?
Well, thanks so much, Simon, for talking us through your article from this week's Life and Arts section in the Financial Times, France's MeToo Moment. You can find it on ft.com. It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for giving us the making up. This is your first piece about feminism, as far as I know, Simon. Is this a new area of inquiry for you?
I'm sure it's not the first, but it's true. I have not written about this